Okay, and I don't know if you heard that, but it just told you that there's a recording in progress. So we are definitely recording now. So I got the idea to do this very plainly from the White House Science Advisor's decision to be sworn into office using a long lost, or at least long ignored, copy of a few pages of the Mishnah. And if you don't know what the Mishnah is, we'll talk about that. But a few pages of the Mishnah, including Pirkei Avot, which is this thing that we sometimes call the Ethics of the Fathers or the Chapters of the Fathers. I'm also getting at least one person on email saying that their passcode doesn't work, which I can't fix for them. So it's called the Ethics of the Fathers or the Chapters of the Fathers or whatever you want to call it. And it's an unusual book for the work that it appears in, because it's just got different stuff. So we'll talk about what's in there. We'll talk about whether the advisor's assertion that it's a book about ethics is correct. And we'll talk about other things too. And I have a sneaking suspicion that we may be joined by a bunch of people later, because at least one person has said they're having trouble logging on, which is a thing that I can't fix for them. So I'll do my best to let people in as we're able to, and I can't control how Zoom works, unfortunately. So, our agenda: locating Avot in time and the Jewish library, looking at the structure of Avot, looking what's in Avot, looking at its function in Jewish thought, asking what we want science advisors. Do we want science advisors being sworn in on Avot? I think a lot of people don't want science advisors being sworn in on much of anything other than maybe a constitution. But here we are. So we'll talk about whether that's the kind of thing you want science advisors sworn in on. And we'll start with, where is Avot in the Jewish library? This is a photo of the printing I used for this, for Pirkei Avot. Just a fragment of a page plus my dining room table. So now you know what my dining room table looks like, although the color is off. It's actually gray. So Avot is part of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is kind of the first known text generated by the rabbis. Dates to 200 CE, and it means repetition. So the idea was that the stuff that's in there were things that were easy to repeat and recite. And a lot of it is written in a way that makes it easy to memorize so that you could then recite it back. It's mostly a collection of statements about Jewish law, mostly. It records contradictory opinions. It's not trying to give you the law. It is trying to give you perspectives on a particular issue. It's divided into kind of 6 divisions or orders. Zeraim, so seeds, which is agricultural law mostly. Seasons and time. Women have their own thing. Men writing laws about women. Yeah, I know. Nezikin, or damages, which is what we would call civil and criminal law. Kodashim, which are holy things, and Toharot, which are purity things. So Kodashim are the things that are holy. Toharot is how you get things pure or made ritually impure. These different sections of the Mishnah. And each section of the Mishnah contains individual tractates. Masechtot is the Hebrew for the plural. Masechet is the singular. On topical areas within the scope of that bigger order. So Nezikin, this area called damages, has what we'd call civil law, criminal penalties, how the courts are supposed to function, and then each of those tractates is divided into chapters. Perek is the word for chapter. Parakim is the plural. Individual units, so each of the individual units is a Mishnah. When you say that in plural, it's Mishnayot. And so the divisions of the text work like Bible verses. So Avot 1:1 means Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah number 1, right? So like Genesis 1:1 is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Same setup here in terms of how we cite it. Very different from what's in the Bible. And 6 are the orders of the Mishnah. There are 6 orders of the Mishnah, but you might remember this from your Passover Haggadah, depending on what version of the Passover Haggadah you used at some point in your life. Chad Gadya is not Chad Gadya, but there's a who knows one, I know one. This is who knows 6, I know 6. Where does Avot fall in all of this? It's the last tractate usually, or the second to last tractate in order Nezikin, so it's with all of the laws about law. It's got 5 chapters. Sometimes there's a 6th tacked on, but it's not really originally part of it. Avot means fathers, and we'll talk more about what Avot actually probably means here as we get there, because it's often called the ethics of the fathers or the chapters of the fathers, and that's not necessarily the fairest description for what Avot is supposed to mean here. We'll talk about whether this placement makes any sense, but it's worth remembering that where a tractate is isn't dependent upon the name where it belongs. So it's part of Nezikin, so it's in this area that's really about damages and the function of courts. But it doesn't really fit in there when we look at it. And there are other tractates of the Talmud and of the Mishnah that don't fit in those broad divisions as well. And if the words are confusing that I've been saying, that's okay. We'll look at it. You'll see how it all works together. If you've studied the Mishnah before, whether it's with me or somebody else or whatever, it is different from other parts of the Mishnah. It's not doing law. It's not framed to give conflicting opinions. So all of the things that make the Mishnah are not here in Avot, except for how you cite stuff. What it does do that other sections of the Mishnah don't do is it tries to explain the rabbi's authority a little bit, and talks about things that a lot of the Mishnah just takes for granted. The rabbis just assume you accept that they're right or that they're in charge, and Avot tries to make an explanation for why you should listen to them. It's 5 chapters, right? I said there's 6, and it's not really part of Avot. 5 chapters that are originally, quote-unquote, originally part of Avot. Chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 1 actually traces the handing down of Torah of some sort from Sinai all the way down to Rabbi Judah HaNasi, who is the person who wrote the Mishnah, compiled the Mishnah. So it's attempting to kind of say, well, he got it from this person who got it from this person who got it from this person, all the way on back to Sinai. That's the claim. And then sayings from each of these folks are put into chapter 1 and 2, and roughly in chronological order of the speaker. Chapters 3 and 4 are more of a grab bag. There's ethics-like statements. There's more rabbis than just these really prominent leaders. It's the leaders that are in chapters 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4 has more variety. Chapter 5 is very different. It has a list of enumerated items and categories, which is a little bit odd, but you'll see what I mean when we get there. Chapter 6, if you have a more traditional Siddur hanging around, a more traditional prayer book hanging around, you will notice that Pirkei Avot is in there, and it includes a 6th chapter. The 6th chapter is not really original to it. It's been pulled from something else, but it's about acquiring Torah, which is really important for what Pirkei Avot is originally understood to be about. And it gets read in synagogues during Shabbat, Shabbat Mincha afternoon services in the summer for more traditional synagogues that do those kinds of services. So it is studied on its own every year. You may have heard about the Talmud, right? There are a lot of people running around, oh, I'm studying a page of Talmud a day, or it's in the Talmud, or whatever it is. Avot is not in the Talmud. It has a Talmudic kind of commentary that's not really a commentary. The Talmud is its own work. There are really two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian one, which is the more authoritative, and the Palestinian one. And each of those really takes little bits of the Mishnah and discusses the topics in there and other topics too. It's a pretty free-ranging discussion. That discussion is called the Gemara. There's no Gemara from this time period, around 500, for the Mishnah. There is another work called the Avot de Rabbi Natan, which claims to have been written by Rabbi Nathan, but he didn't write it because he can't. The language isn't right. That is kind of like a Gemara Talmud kind of thing for Avot, but it's also not. It's really a bunch of sermons that are kind of hooked into parts of Avot. So there's really not a Talmud. You won't, if you go buy a set of Talmud, you're not going to find Pirkei Avot in there. It's just not going to be there. If you go buy a set of the Mishnah, you will. And you can buy separate volume, just Pirkei Avot, with all kinds of commentary and all kinds of pictures and whatever else. So this is an illustrated Pirkei Avot. This was started as somebody's thesis project at the Parsons School of Art and Design. And translations, it's like a graphic novel kind of thing, but with Pirkei Avot. So there's all kinds of ways that you can get this work. You can also just go online and find translations of it. So kind of to wrap up, Avot is one part of the Mishnah. Avot means fathers, but we're going to talk about why fathers is a weird title, or a weird translation for what it really is about. Avot is in Nezikin, so it's in the section that talks about being a judge, that talks about how law is administered, that talks about what the damages are when you hurt somebody, that talks about why you have to have a railing on the roof of your house. Right? There are all these rules that we don't really think about very much, but they're in the Talmud. Inheritance, these kinds of things. Avot has 5 original chapters, plus a 6th one that gets tacked on, gets read in synagogues sometimes, is not part of the Talmud, but has a Talmudic kind of thing. So as we move forward, we want to ask, why is it called Avot? What's even in it? Why is it important in the history of Jewish thought? Is it really a work of ethics as it's described? In the way that it's used in the modern period, when we see people quoting from Avot, how faithful is that to what the original thought was in putting together this tractate, this thing called Avot? How connected is that to what, if you asked one of these rabbis, well, what did you mean by that? Would their answer be the answer that we would give if we used some piece of it? And we'll see how there's sometimes a really big gap between what they meant and what we mean. So we'll start with what's in there. So most of the Mishnah has apodictic or casuistic statements of law. Okay, these are fancy Greek words. One's Greek and one's Latin. There you go. It has statements of law that just are, you do X. In the morning, the Shema gets recited at such and such a time. Or casuistic, if such and such a thing happens, this is what you do. And so you get these just statements. What time do you recite the morning Shema? From the time when you can distinguish between blue and white. And Rabbi Eliezer says between blue and green. And you have to finish by sunrise. And Rabbi Joshua says until the 3rd hour. Right? So you're getting a rule and you're getting some variations on the rule and you're getting it attributed to somebody. And this seems not very easy to memorize in English, but it's actually pretty easy to memorize these in Hebrew. Avot isn't set up like this. There's not a lot of legal stuff. We're not counterposing one rabbi's statement against another very often. And they're not put in you're wrong, I'm right kind of tension. They kind of are additive more than anything else. So I've grabbed one from kind of the late in Avot so that we can see how it really works, what it looks like. So Elisha ben Avuya, I picked this one because Elisha ben Avuya in rabbinic literature is not usually called by his name. He is usually called Acher, which means other in Hebrew, because he is reputed to have become a heretic. But they still quote him because some of his teachings are still considered pretty good. And so he says, one who learns as a child, what's he like ink written on new parchment. One who learns as an older person, what is he like ink written on a rubbed out piece of parchment. We'll explain that in a minute, I guess. Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, a man of Kfar ha-Bavli, that's really what it says, one who learns from the young, what is he like? One who eats unripe grapes and drinks wine from his vat, and one who learns from the old, what's he like one who eats ripe grapes and drinks old wine. Rabbi says, don't look to the container, but what's within it. There's a new container full of old wine and an old container that doesn't even have new within it. So these are all different takes on the role of age in learning, the role of age in having information to share, the ability of age to teach, and different variations on how well does somebody who's young learn versus somebody who's new, right? This is the ink on new parchment. Ink on new parchment just kind of sticks. Ink on old parchment that's been rubbed out doesn't stick as well. Parchment was expensive, so you would erase parchment. You can kind of rub stuff out on parchment, and so you rub out parchment, and it gets old and harder to write on. And then you have this other rabbi who says, well, young people haven't had time to get their knowledge up to speed and right for the world. So if you learn from somebody who's young, you're getting immature information. If you learn from somebody who's old, you've had somebody who's had a lot of time to learn. And so their information is really good because it's really, really, really connected to a long life and a lot of wisdom. And then Rabbi, so this is the person who really assembled the Mishnah. Rabbi says, okay, well, don't look at the person, look at what's in there. Because sometimes young people have very wise things to say, and sometimes older people don't have wise things to say, right? So this has a little bit more of contradiction in it than is usual for Avot, but it also gives you a sense for what's in there, right? These kinds of, we're going to use a lot of illustrations to make our point, and we're not going to come out and say, young people have no good information, and older people have lots of great information. We're going to say it a different way. Setting aside for the moment all of what that meant, there's no legal material here. There's nothing here that says, well, you have to recite the Shema 3 times a day, 2 times a day. You have to recite the Shema 2 times a day. You have to recite this thing 5 times a day. You have to do this. You have to do that. None of that's there. There are these kind of indirect statements that use simile and metaphor and analogy to kind of get their point across, right? It's sort of almost folksy wisdom in the way it's presented sometimes. And it's wisdom-y, right? Not really focused on behavior requirements and legal consequences necessarily, but like other stuff, right? The way of the world kinds of insights. So that's what's most of in Avot. Right? Chapter 5, I mentioned, has kind of a different set of things, and we'll look at those briefly. But this is where Avot starts. And it says, Moshe received Torah, not the Torah, but Torah. We'll talk about why that is. Moshe received Torah from Sinai and passed it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, prophets passed it down to the men of the great assembly. They, this meaning the men of the great assembly, said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, meaning in a legal context, raise up many students, and make a fence for the Torah. So right off the bat, they're telling you to do things, but they're not making statements about you know, you have to say these 3 prayers in this order or something like that. It's much more, hey, here's what being wise is about. This is how you should really do it. Shimon the righteous was among the last of the great assembly, and he used to say the world stands on 3 things: upon Torah, upon divine service, and upon acts of loving kindness. So divine service, we mean worship. Where the temple's standing, he would mean sacrificing at the temple. Shimon the righteous, if he was around for the great assembly, was around when there was a temple. So that's what he would have meant. So again, yeah, you should study the Torah, and this is what makes the world stand up, right? Not legal stuff. What makes the world work? The Torah makes the world work. Antigonus, the man from Socho, received from Shimon the righteous, and he used to say, don't be like the servants who work for their master to receive a prize. Rather be like servants who work for their master not to receive a prize, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. You may have heard of the idea of Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. And this is Antigonus, the man from Socho, saying, Torah for its own sake. Don't do it to get a reward. You do it because you're supposed to do it. And let the fear of heaven be upon you. Right? This is the kind of stuff that's in Avot. We're going to fast forward to people we might recognize, Hillel and Shammai, because you can get lost in the generations of people who are receiving the Torah from other people. Speeding up to Hillel and Shammai, we see they receive from the pairs, the last of the pairs, these guys, Shemaiah and Avtalion. Hillel says, be among the students of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving creation, which means humans, but it's creation, not people, and bringing them near to the Torah. Again, there are instructions, but you're supposed to bring people near to the Torah. You know that, right? I mean, they're sort of reinforcing things that aren't specifically Torah instructions. They're not laws. They are these other things that maybe make you a better person, right? Soon after this, we get transmission by association. We stop saying this one's passed down to this one, passed down to this one, and we get Rabban Gamliel saying, make a teacher for yourself and remove doubt from yourself, or get a teacher for yourself and remove your doubt. There's no punctuation in the original, so it's not 100% clear what it's supposed to say. And don't make a habit of tithing by estimate. This is the closest I've seen to an actual legal thing in Avot, basically telling you measure carefully, because tithing is an important thing for making the temple work. So make a teacher for yourself. Remove doubt. Don't make a habit of tithing by estimate, right? These are not, that's good advice, right? And then we get kind of a trace of transmission from Rabban Gamliel to his son to Shimon ben Gamliel's grandson and then rabbi. So we've got to get the Torah from Moses to the rabbi who puts together the Mishnah to make the Mishnah authoritative. This doesn't happen anywhere else in the Mishnah. This is not how the Mishnah starts. The Mishnah starts by telling you when you recite the evening Shema. It doesn't say, here's how the Torah was transmitted. Because it's not playing the game that we expect that we expect the Mishnah to play as Westerners. We are accustomed to, okay, you start with your most basic assumption and you work for it, and that's just not how these texts work. So it really doesn't get to this until 2/3 of the way through the entire Mishnah. You finally get somebody saying, oh, this is where the law came from. So rabbi is referred to as rabbi. We've already seen him quoted. He's referred to as rabbi because he's the foremost rabbi of his time. He was the representative to Rome. He compiled the Mishnah. You get lots of extra points and you become just rabbi. So what's in Avot, some of it is legitimating the chain of rabbinic authority. We can trace the Torah, Avot says, we can trace the giving of Torah from Moses all the way down to the person who wrote the Mishnah, which means all the way down to the person who wrote Avot, who wrote this work. we cannot actually do this, right? We don't know who all of these other people are that they're talking about who would have passed these rules down. There's no way to connect it, even if it were a thing that actually happened. God, no, we have really no direct evidence from Mount Sinai. We have no direct evidence that Joshua lived, right? It's all very vague. But you believe it if you're already inclined to believe it. So lots of people think that this is actually what happened, and Maimonides actually starts his legal code by tracing this again. And he writes a commentary on the Mishnah that has a really long essay about how all of this worked. Now, how did somebody living around 1200 BC, around 1200 CE know how all of this stuff worked? 1200 years plus before his own lifetime. He didn't, but he wrote stuff. What else is there? We've got instructions on how to engage in judgment, right? Be deliberate in judgment. We have instructions on building virtue. Build a fence for the Torah. Don't seek reward. Be like the sons of Aaron and pursue peace. Statements on the nature of creation and reality. The world stands on three things. Not on the back of a turtle. Not on the back of turtles all the way down. In case you've ever heard that story. But Torah, divine service, deeds of loving kindness. There's a number of these different on three things does the world stand. There are statements on how learning and teaching works. Discussion of young and old students, old and new parchment. We looked at that, right? And the new wineskins and new wine and old wine and new containers and old containers. If that seems familiar, there's an earlier document that has discussion of old wine and new wineskins. It's the New Testament. So lots of people talk about wine. It's a thing that makes sense in the ancient world to talk about. Doesn't make a lot of sense to us because we have stainless steel containers and we don't use wineskins anymore. We'll see lots of these kinds of statements, lots of units of three, which is a convenient mnemonic, and an entire chapter of Avot has statements of things in threes and tens and sevens and fours, and there's all kinds of interest in that sort of stuff in Avot. And we'll talk about why I'm talking about Marcus Aurelius in just a second. Larry, you've got a virtual hand.
So I tried, I don't want to impede you and I don't want us to get into a rabbit hole, but I sort of can't contain my question. A 2-second search of Google just now indicates that, my question is, does it say in the Bible that Moses gave the Torah to Joshua?
Nope.
I never heard that before.
Nope.
So the whole thing is built on an assertion. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So we don't have to believe that, right?
Well, you don't have to believe what's in the Bible either, but yeah.
I know, but I'm being a little, sarcastic. But that was sort of a revelation, except I didn't think it was true. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. We don't have anything to prove. We don't even have a biblical text that proves that. In fact, we have a medieval rabbi who points out that Moses can't have written his own death story, and so somebody else wrote it. I mean, the rabbis figure out pretty early on you can't say the stuff that they're going to say and really have it work. So what is this stuff about where teaching comes from and these sort of folksy-ish sayings? What's it like? Well, this is from the first chapter of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. From my grandfather Verus, I learned good morals and government of my temper. From the reputation and remembrance of my father, modesty and a manly character. From my mother, piety and beneficence and abstinence. Again, he's not saying do this, do that, do the other thing. He's saying I got this teaching from. From my great-grandfather, not to have frequented public schools. Well, that's depressing. And to have had good teachers at home and know that on such things a man should spend liberally. Now, remember, he's the Roman emperor, so he's got a lot of money to throw around. That's a lot like what we're seeing in Avot. What is the source of this ethical learning that I'm giving you? And each generation he attaches statements to those people. also not too dissimilar in some ways from Seneca's letters, the moral letters to Lucilius. He alone is in kinship with God who has scorned wealth. I don't forbid you to possess it, but I would have you reach the point at which you possess it dauntlessly. This can be accomplished only by persuading yourself that you can live happily without it as well as with it, and by regarding riches always as likely to elude you. So we have these are, I've picked these two on purpose. These are Roman Stoic philosophers. And they say things that aren't necessarily very different from some of the things that show up throughout Pirkei Avot. We're going to see one that talks about how, yeah, actually you shouldn't be too concerned about being in business because it impedes your ability to learn Torah, right? Here it is, don't get hung up on wealth. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you you don't have money, but, you should also not think that you're going to come into money ever. Money is not the most important thing. And so I've provided you, we have quasi-contemporaneous sculptures of some of these people from the Roman period. We obviously don't have sculptures of any of the ancient rabbis. If you go online and you search and you find these ancient rabbis' pictures, you're finding people making up the image. So if you're wondering, weren't we supposed to be talking about Pirkei Avot? What are you talking about dead Romans for? Everything's from somewhere and sometime. The Mishnah dates to around 200 CE. Avot's part of that. Marcus Aurelius is a contemporary of Shimon ben Gamliel the second and rabbi. So two people whose names we've seen are contemporaries of Marcus Aurelius. Seneca the Younger was a contemporary of Rabban Gamliel a century before. Judea and the Galilee were part of the Roman Empire, had been tied into Hellenistic culture for centuries, true for cultures throughout the Middle East and North Africa, which also had wisdom literature that's kind of like what we've seen in Pirkei Avot. And Avot is this distinct blend of existing, I've used Mina, Middle Eastern North Africa, literary form of aphoristic wisdom literature with Stoic-like content. So there's something very Greek about a lot of what's in Pirkei Avot. And there's not a lot of focus on Torah. There's not a lot of focus on the afterlife. There's a lot of focus on how you live in this world. But it's like for building virtue. And they have a very kind of pursue moderation sort of thing that's very much like Stoic philosophy. So everything comes from somewhere. And Avot comes from the Greco-Roman world. And this is part of the cultural stuff of the Greco-Roman world. So am I saying that they were reading Seneca and Marcus Aurelius? Well, no, because those were in Latin. But Stoic philosophy was around from like the 300s BCE, so 500 years before the Mishnah, we have Stoic philosophy, and was part of the Hellenistic cultural stew. People knew this. There were Jewish scholars who knew this stuff, and even if they weren't reading Greek philosophy, these ideas would still have been in the air because most of the rabbis, unlike a lot of their contemporaries, could read and write, were engaged in intellectual discourse, and so they would have had some knowledge. And it's worth paying attention to the fact that there are rabbis with Greek names. So we know that the rabbis were engaged in the broader Hellenistic world because you don't get a name like Antigonus unless your father was really, really into being Greek as a Jew. You don't get a name like Eliezer ben Hyrcanus unless your grandfather was really into Greek culture in some way. Jews were getting Greek names even though the rabbis talk about not studying Greek philosophy and don't really have a lot nice to say about the Greeks. So there's a little bit of a protesting too much kind of thing happening with the rabbis because some of them have Greek names. we'll see at least one more rabbi with a Greek name tonight. So they have these Greek names. They are engaging in something that seems a lot like secular Greek philosophy. I don't want to call it, you can't call Greek philosophy in this time period secular because that's not really a category, but definitely not Jewish philosophical thought is at least in the background. So you kind of have to know that about the rabbis generally too. They know this stuff. They may not be sitting around reading Plato, but they know some of these ideas because they live in this world. So there's lots of famous sayings in Pirkei Avot. I want to make sure we talk about some of the famous sayings because I think they help us evaluate what you do with Pirkei Avot. How comfortable are we with somebody being sworn in on Pirkei Avot? We ought to talk about what these famous sayings are because they're surprising. I think they're surprising when you start to dig into them. So the most famous of all, right, is Hillel saying, if I am not for me, who is for me? And when I am for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? You have not heard it phrased quite like this before. You've probably heard it phrased, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what or who am I? And if not now, when? First of all, there's no future tense verbs in the Hebrew in this thing. That's why you have this very clunky, if I am not for me, who is for me, right? There's no will. That's not there. What else is different? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I am not for me, who is for me? And when I am for myself, not if I am only for myself, because it doesn't say that. It says when I am for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? This is a lot of the time presented as kind of this golden mean thing. A kind of golden mean about self-esteem, right? Hillel said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? I have to take care of myself. And if I'm only for myself, who or what am I? Well, if I'm too self-centered, no one's going to care, but for the other reason. And if not now, when? And then you're stuck trying to figure out what that means, and probably just means be a better person now, right? That's how this statement is frequently presented. There is even, I know a lot of you know, there's a group called If Not Now, which is a primarily younger people, Jewish group oriented toward opposition to Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Well, it's not really occupation in the Gaza Strip. There's kind of cordoning off. But they are an organization opposed to how Israel deals with Palestinians. They call themselves If Not Now to emphasize the urgency of doing something about this problem. And they're getting it from right here. They looked at the Hillel thing and they went, perfect. It's urgent. So we're going to take a second look at this. And we're going to take a second look at it through the eyes of kind of the heirs of the rabbis to see what Jewish tradition over the course of the centuries has actually thought this means, because it's different. And we're going to do it with Rabbi Ovadya of Bartinura from the late 15th, early 16th century, from Bartinura, which was one of the papal states, which, if you've forgotten your history, the papal states eventually become part of Italy. For the most part, the Vatican is the exception. The foremost commentator on the Mishnah, so if you buy a Hebrew copy of the Mishnah, not an English language copy, if you buy a traditional Hebrew copy from a, pretty orthodox bookstore, he is in the standard edition. So I'll ask you to just kind of look at the camera. So this is my copy of the Mishnah. I'm actually open to a vote because I think I've broken the spine in that spot. This is a vote right here, the main part of the Mishnah. This commentary around the edge on the spine of the book is All-Ovadya of Bartinura, he's considered to be the most important basic commentary on the Mishnah, because he does what other commentators do that makes them the standard commentators. It summarizes all the stuff that's in the background. So Bartinura summarizes primarily Rashi, who was the commentator on the Talmud, and Maimonides. We know who Moses Maimonides is, but Moses Maimonides actually wrote 2 commentaries on Avot. He wrote a commentary on the whole Mishnah, and in that there's a commentary on Avot, but he also wrote another work called the 8 Chapters, which was like sermons about Pirkei Avot. And he actually wrote the 8 chapters before he wrote the commentary on the Mishnah. So his commentary on the Mishnah copies his 8 chapters. Ovadya of Bartinura is reading these people and summarizing their teaching. And Rashi is the only reason that some of the Talmud is understandable. So Ovadya of Bartinura's commentary is pretty reliable as a distillation of the tradition, as it understands Pirkei Avot. And if you've read the whole slide, yes, the Bartinura brand of wine is named for him. One of their brands is Ovadya. You can also get Bartinura wine in cans now. They are the second company to make kosher wine that you can get in cans. But it's kosher wine with a cork, right? So it's not Manischewitz with the screw top. So this is this guy, Ovadya of Bartinura, who writes this commentary that becomes sort of the starting point for when you study the Mishnah on its own in a traditional context. And Ovadya breaks down this "if I am not for me" thing piece by piece. If I am not for me, if I don't acquire merit for myself, who will acquire merit on my behalf? Not, if I don't take care of myself, no one will take care of me, but acquire merit. And this word merit, the word is zechut, and the Hebrew word is zechut, and it's really talking about acquiring Torah merit. We're not talking about being just a generally good person, he says. We're not talking about being an ethical person. We're not talking about being somebody who's really great to other people. We're not talking about your self-esteem and your feelings. We're talking about you doing Torah. If I don't acquire merit for myself, who will do it? Because other people can't, with some exceptions, people can't do commandments for you in the rabbinic mindset. You have to do it yourself. And when I am for myself, so this is the second part, that if I'm only for myself, that's how we usually translate this. This is him talking about that part. And he says, even if I do acquire merit for myself, what is it? And what is its importance compared to what I am liable, legally obligated in rabbinic law, to do? So you can go chasing merit, but if it means that you're not paying attention to your other obligations with Torah, this has done you no good. If I'm only for myself, what am I? It's not about other people. It's about what your priorities are in seeking after Torah merit. This is Bartinura's take on it. And for the most part, what Bartinura is doing here is he's just rephrasing Maimonides. So this is what Maimonides' take on it was. If not now, meaning I have to do it in this world, when? For after death, you can't fulfill commandments after you die. So you have to do it in this world. Or another interpretation, if not now, in the days of one's youth, when? Since in old age you might not be able to do so. So Ovadya is saying, look, this statement, he's not going to say, this statement that you moderns talk about as though it's some like self-help thing, although that's what we do. He's like, that's not what this is about. This is about Torah. This is balancing your obligations in Torah against trying to affirmatively go get Torah merit by going to brisses and going to weddings and visiting people when they're sick and going to funerals, right? These are all things that get you merit. But if you're not saying prayers 3 times a day, Ovadya would say, you've missed the point. This is a consistent viewpoint with the rest of Avot. So this isn't Bartinura quoting Maimonides, who's like, I'm going to reinterpret the words of this completely. His understanding of it matches up. Don't be like servants who work for their master to receive a prize. Be like servants who work not to receive a prize, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. This, if I am only for myself, who will be for me? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Does not mean the self-helpy thing we take it to mean, according to Ovadya, according to Maimonides, according to the rabbis that came before him. It means you have to do the Torah, and you should chase after merit a little bit, but you should understand that you've got obligations too. And you need to do it now, because when you're older, you might not be able to do any of this. Apparently my internet connection is unstable, even though I'm wired into a jack. So if I stop, I apologize. Avot, like many rabbinic texts, doesn't mean to the rabbis what we think it means when we just give it a surface reading. It's deceptive and confusing in that way. Here's another one. Gets quoted all the time. I must see this thing on Facebook every week. If you're not on Facebook, if you're not seeing this every week, that's okay. This is Rabbi Tarfon, another Greek name. Rabbi Tarfon, used to say, it's not upon you to finish the work, and neither are you free, ben chorin, to desist from it. If you learn much Torah, people will attribute much reward to you, and have faith that the master of your work shall compensate you the wages of your labors. But no, the gift of the wages of the righteous is in a future to come. This has a little bit of, if not now, when, to it. This has a little bit of remove doubt from yourself. See, we've seen chunks of this kinds of statements before. Not upon you to finish the work, but you're not free to stop it. You have to have faith that the master of your work will compensate you, but not in this world. And it has some of this let fear of heaven be upon you kind of thing happening. Again, we look at this and we see it quoted all the time in social justice circles in particular. We see it quoted all the time as you don't have to finish the work, but you got to do something. You're not free not to act. So go out there and go to the protest or whatever it is. Do what you can, right? That's what this is quoted for. Except that's not what he's talking about. Even in his original context. You're not free to desist. If you learn Torah, people will attribute reward, right? He's talking about something not, don't feel bad if you can't go to this protest, but go to the protest you can go to. Don't sit back and do nothing, but don't feel like you didn't fix the problem personally and so you're a bad person, right? That's how we see this thing quoted. That's not what Rabbi Tarfon was talking about originally. So Ovadya says, it's not incumbent upon you to finish the work. This is not about fixing the world. This is your wages. I just abbreviate the Holy One, blessed be He. That's the translation in English to HKBH because it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Hebrew. It's just easier to type that than to type out the Holy One, blessed be He. Your wages are not conditioned upon finishing all of it, such that you might lose your wages if you're not finished. This is because you might say, I won't learn and I won't seek them. Right? So this is Rabbi Tarfon saying, okay, look, you're never going to keep the entire Torah. But you have to do what you can. You're not free to desist because you might say, well, I can't succeed, so I'm just not going to do any of it. And the reward you get is in the next life, not this one. This is not the same thing in its kind of original setting. This isn't the same thing as saying, the world is broken, do what you can to fix the world. You're not going to be able to do it all yourself. So don't feel bad that you didn't fix it all, but you gotta do something. Which is how this thing is quoted most of the time. So just this is what people quote, and they don't look at the rest. So I'm pointing this out to say that this is the entire context of the stuff that's in the book that Dr. Lander asked the Library of Congress to provide for him when he put his hand on it to make an oath. That's what this book actually says. So if we want to put our hands on a book, we should know maybe what's in the book. Do we really agree with what's in the book? So this is what is meant. Neither are you free to desist from it. I pointed out that the free here was Ben Chorin. This is more just a fun observation for people who remember stuff from the Passover Haggadah. It might be more familiar if you hear the plural Bnei Chorin, which is in a song in the Passover Seder, in the traditional Haggadah, and in some humanistic Haggadot too. We were slaves in Egypt, but now we are free. Avadim hayinu ata bnei chorin. Right. So they used ben chorin to make the connect. Right. There's a similar phrase. When the Haggadah says, now we are free, ata bnei chorin, it does not mean we're free of obligations. It's just we have different obligations. So the rabbis are not imagining this as, oh, well, you have no obligations. It's just an interesting thing to note that they know what they're doing when they put these texts together. So, Roberto, you've got a hand up.
Yes. So, right. It seems like the some of those interpretations are coming from Ovadya and from Maimonides, right? So there is no one to say that they necessarily gave the right interpretation, because they are also not contemporaneous to Tarfon or to, so, and I'm not saying that, right, the intent was not religious, but I think it seems to me, by especially reading the previous parts that you even, I think correctly put in the context of what the Stoics and others were saying, right? There is some kind of moral virtue embedded in terms of the things that they were saying. So I doubt that there was, a complete, this is just about the Torah kind of advice, right? So I was kind of wondering if that's not kind of, and I'm not saying, right, obviously everybody decides which book they want to use to make their commitment. So not necessarily that that's right or wrong, but I'm trying to say that it's possible, right, that in the general context of the uncertainty of what was written and why it was written, that one could possibly see what something a little more virtuous, right, and not purely religious and Torah related in terms of what they're saying.
Yeah, and we're on our way to that. So we will be talking about that soon, because, right, the stuff superficially, if you just at first read, doesn't read Torah religious, right? I mean, Rabbi Tarfon's thing, if you just pull a statement, it doesn't seem terribly religious. We looked at this thing from Elisha ben Avuya and the two other rabbis where they said, where they talked about the nature of learning. That wasn't at all wasn't really a Torah thing, right? You can take that thing and go, oh, I know what this means. This is about how people learn and the value of their knowledge and what they share related to their age. So it's not necessarily strictly directly Torah connected, right? So there is an ethical thing happening in the background. Otherwise, it makes no sense to talk about Seneca and the emperor guy, Marcus Aurelius, the emperor guy. I'm sure that I have a graduate advisor somewhere now shaking their head saying he just called up Marcus Aurelius the emperor guy. I did. These are not Jewish sources of wisdom, and yet here they are with stuff that sounds a lot like Pirkei Avot, right? Now, they have different purposes and things like that, but there's similar sounding things happening here. So here's another one. Does it mean be a mensch? Hillel used to say, a boor does not fear sin, and ignoramus is not righteous. The bashful person cannot learn, the hot-tempered person cannot teach, and someone who heavily engages in commerce does not become wise. And in a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. And it's often just in a place where there are no men, strive to be a man is what's quoted. So, and then it gets translated as in a place where there are no good people, strive to be a good person. And we separate this out from the rest, and it's a nice, small, capsule, ethical thing, and we take it to mean, be a mensch. Of course, Ovadya has something else to say, and he says, look, these are each different levels of person. So a boor does not fear sin. Somebody who's a boor just doesn't care. An ignoramus, so the Hebrew here is am ha'aretz, like a bumpkin, is not righteous, and the word righteous here is chassid, right? So it's not that this person is going after sin in the same way, it's just they're not as bad. This is what he's saying here, is a boor doesn't fear sin, and ignoramus is not righteous. It's not quite as bad as the boor, he just doesn't know what he's doing. A bashful person cannot learn, not assertive enough. A bashful person can be righteous, but can't learn. A hot-tempered person can't teach, doesn't have enough patience. Someone who engages in commerce doesn't become wise, so that person can learn and can teach, but can't be wise because they're too concerned about business things. They're not really thinking deeply enough. So Ovadya says, so what does it mean? And in a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. He says, in a place where there are no men means somebody who can sit at the front and teach Torah. That's what this means. So this is about teaching. This is a text about how to be a teacher. Just as there are things in Avot that are about how to be a judge, right? Be patient in judgment. Don't be partial in judgment, right? There are these things that we know about. This is, in its context, understood differently. In, again, the traditional Jewish interpretive history, right? There's 2,000 years of, 1,800 years of interpretation of rabbinic texts, and this is part of it. So what we draw little quotations, and it works one way for us. They would look in context, and it would seem like a very different text in their eyes than it does to ours. So if we went to talk to Ovadya today, presuming that we could, his understanding of Avot would be very different from our understanding of Avot, and very different from our use of the text. Which leaves us all kind of to wonder, what is Pirkei Avot? Because I've shown you these texts that we sometimes quote. Machar has at various points in the past, in its Passover Seder, sung the Hebrew for in a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. It's been in the Haggadah at various points. And that's it. That's the only part of this that was in the Haggadah. It's just b'makom she'en anashim hishtadel lihyot ish, right? In a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. That is a song. We have sung that song. Just as there are songs made from there are three pillars upon which the world stands, and right, there are songs for a lot of these things. They're well known. They get sung. They get quoted. They get quoted out of context. They get these different meanings. In their original setting, in their broader setting, through rabbinic eyes, they look different. So what is Pirkei Avot actually doing? What's it trying to do? Why does it have the name it has? right? These are all things we should ask about this document to be able to assess, do you put your hand on it to make an oath? So what does Pirkei Avot think it's about? So Pirkei Avot, the Pirkei part is chapters. Avot is the plural of father. I'm not going to go into the grammar as to why it's parakim, chapters, but Pirkei, chapters. Just trust me, it is. The Hebrew speakers will go, yeah, construct state, or smichut. Okay. Or I'll say it so that they won't then feel the need to say. So Pirkei Avot, chapters of the fathers. It sometimes is called the ethics of the fathers. I have to tell you, the word for chapter does not have anything to do with ethics. And the rabbis never called themselves fathers. I mean, they were fathers, right? They had children and they would think of themselves as fathers in that way, but they never called themselves the fathers. When they talked about the fathers, Avot, they meant Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob don't come up very much in Pirkei Avot, and they're not a central theme. So, what's it talking about? Pirkei Avot, chapters of the fathers. So the word avot can also mean category in the rabbi's use of Hebrew. So avot malacha are the categories of work that are prohibited on Shabbat. So Pirkei Avot might mean chapters of categories, meaning it's a book about categories of people and categories of traits and categories of characteristics of the world. Which makes a lot more sense than chapters of the fathers for people who never called themselves that. So something to think about is its title may mean something different may have meant something very different to them than it means to us. What does Avot think it's doing? If we look at the text that we looked at, and they do represent what's in the book, we could read the whole thing, but I don't want to type that all into a PowerPoint slide. You can find it online. You can read it yourself. If we look at the texts and they're representative with the traditional understanding that they have, you get a different view of what Pirkei Avot is about. It's about training and focusing attitudes and habits related to Torah observance. Now, I'm going to get to how it's an ethics thing. There's a secondary goal of establishing the authority of the rabbis, and I mentioned Maimonides does something like this too. And there's another goal, describing categories of existence or personality or stages of life, and we've seen a little bit of it, but chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot is one of those things where if you talk to people who say, I'm going to read the entire Bible, and they kind of fall down at Genesis 5, because that's where the genealogy is. It's not very interesting. And then they didn't really read Leviticus, or actually they stopped reading Exodus at about chapter 20, and they didn't pick it up again until Numbers, because there's a lot of laws. I don't want to keep track of that. This is one of those where it's interesting to pull stuff from, but it's a hard read because it's just, there are numbers of X, there are numbers of Y. And so it has things like 10 statements the world was created. There are 10 generations from Adam to Noah. There are 4 kinds of people. There are 4 kinds of students. There are 4 kinds of temperaments. This is how someone gets angry. So it's doing all of these different things. Training and focusing attitudes. It's doing this thing about explaining its own authority, right? It's sort of saying, we got this from Moses, and Moses got it from God, so trust us. And then stages of life, how the world was created, statements about how the world was created, right? These categories of numerical things, which is very much unlike the other stuff, which probably means that it actually was tacked on later. So what is Avot doing? So Alan Middleman, who's a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote a book called A Short History of Jewish Ethics, which I can't say is a barn burner of a read, really, but his introduction is actually really interesting because he takes up the issue of, is there such a thing as Jewish ethics? We talk about Jewish ethics all the time. We talk about Jewish values all the time. There are people who think there's no such thing as Jewish ethics. Particularly in the Orthodox world, there are people who think Jewish ethics isn't a thing because there's a Torah. And the Torah tells you what to do. So you don't need ethics, quote unquote ethics, because you have the Torah. And there is one scholar, Michael Wischergrad, who has actually said that Jewish ethics only really matters to secular people because they don't follow the Torah, so they need something. Right? It's a very kind of not nice perspective on ethics and on non-Orthodox Jews. Alan Middleman says, yes, there is such a thing as Jewish ethics. And what Jewish ethics is doing is not providing measurements of behavior, but is trying to develop moral psychology. That what books like Pirkei Avot are doing is they're trying to train your brain to do better. And in the case of Avot, it's trying to train people to do better as people who keep Torah. But look, a lot of the stuff is not necessarily bad for other purposes. So what Avot is doing, and this is Alan Middleman's argument, but I think it's a pretty good argument in its traditional context. What Avot is doing is what's called Machar, correction, trying to make people better at Torah by making them better people. Because there's this saying from Nachmanides, who's a 13th century biblical commentator and mystic, who said, essentially, you can follow the Torah and be a rascal. You could be a terrible person and still obey the Torah. That was his take. You could be a really unpleasant person, but follow the commandments. Avot and some of these other books, their goal is to make you a better person all the way around. And that's what Avot is up to in the traditional kind of understanding of what its work is. It's improving moral psychology, making you a better person, better capable of following the Torah. That's its job. Again, in its traditional setting, right? There's always this question of, okay, well, it's a Jewish text and we're Jewish and we have access to the text, and what does it mean for us to work with this text now? But part of what we were going to talk about is, why is this thing important in the history of Jewish thought? And this is its job in the history of Jewish thought. And it's got so many different little nuggets of stuff that there's lots of stuff to pull on. And it's very useful throughout Jewish history for finding things. And we see it even at work today, right? The stuff from Hillel, if I am only for myself, what am I, right? We understand that taken out of its original meaning, original sets of meanings, we recognize it as something different. That still isn't wrong, right? We recognize, if I'm only for myself, what am I? We have to engage with other people, right? We recognize all of these things. Avot's doing that too. But Avot's goal, the purpose of Avot in being written, was not the purpose that we put it to. Which, again, there's always this question of, okay, so what do we do with Jewish texts? How much should we be bound by their original meaning? How much do we reinterpret them? So let's talk about Dr. Lander's statement, his speech, when he swore his oath as White House science advisor. So Dr. Lander gives us kind of a 4-point summary at the end, where he says, this is a book that bears upon the paramount ethical obligation to repair the world, which I hold dear and which underlies the goals of this administration and the goals of science. Goal of science is to repair the world. A book that is one of the earliest fruits of a revolutionary information technology that swept the world. He means the printing press. I feel like I should point that out. A book whose year and place of publication speak of religious tolerance and intolerance. So this book was printed in 1492. It was printed in Italy. So Italy was actually kind of nice to Jews. And certain Italian cities and city-states were kind of nice to Jews in the 1400s and 1500s. So there were Jewish presses working in these cities. So this was printed in Italy in 1492 when Jews were being expelled from Spain. A book whose existence would not be known but for the work of a scholar who chose to enter into public service. So this is the book that he had was like a 13-page booklet that had been kind of forgotten. And a Jewish employee of the Library of Congress kind of found the thing and cataloged it. Had they not found it, maybe we wouldn't know that it was there. So, it gets to underscore the value of public service. It gets to underscore the origins of the thing. It's about he's interested in technology because part of the White House science advisor's job is technology advising. And then bears upon the paramount ethical obligation to repair the world. So that's tikkun olam. In Hebrew, I should really point out, there's no tikkun olam mentioned anywhere in Pirkei Avot by those words, which I hold dear and which underlies the goals of this administration and the goals of science. I am not 100% clear that the goals of science are repairing the world. But Dr. Lander says it is now. And this is more from his speech. Importantly, we must continue to repair the world, even knowing that we will never perfect it. Still, every day we must keep trying. It is not required that you complete the work, but neither may you refrain from it. So in modern Jewish tradition, this obligation is rooted in the words. Right? So here's an acknowledgement that that's not what the book originally means. It's not what the book was trying to get across to its readers. But it is what it gets across to its readers now. This passage comes from the oral traditions, sometimes called the Oral Torah, that were compiled 1,800 years ago into a long Jewish text called the Mishnah. Specifically, those words come from an unusual section of the Mishnah called Pirkei Avot that is focused exclusively on ethics. So we can continue to ask, is it really about ethics? Is it about social justice? Is the Torah itself about social justice? There are some things in the Torah that are not socially just. And there are some things in the Torah that are. And then these other reasons. Is it about tikkun olam? I don't know. And I don't know that science is about tikkun olam. A book that's one of the earliest fruits of revolutionary information technology. Yeah, it's a very early book. That seems fair. A book whose year and place of publication, right? It's an interesting relic from an interesting time. And we wouldn't know about it, but for the work of a scholar who chose to enter public service. So I'm a scholar who's entering public service, right? That's the comparison that he's making. So some of what he's saying seems fairly defensible, and some of what he's saying to me doesn't seem terribly defensible. I'm not really sure that we want to say that the goals of science are tikkun olam. I think that's the use science gets put to. Would the people who wrote Avot recognize what he's saying about the book that they wrote? Maybe not. But that's up for grabs, right? What does this text mean? Because once you write a thing and it goes out in the world, you don't have control over it anymore. So there's the question to ask: are we okay with this? And everybody's going to have a different answer. I will be very honest. I'm not 100% sure I'm okay with this. It is a very, in its original intent, it is a very Torah-focused text, even if it doesn't always say that. Right? It's there to reinforce the religious authority of some people by making claims that can't really be proved. It's got this consistent focus that it keeps coming back to on the idea that you should do things not for reward. You should be confident that you're going to get a reward in the next world, but you don't do things for the reward. You do things because Torah says you do it. Right? That's a through line in this text. Am I okay with the science advisor putting their hands on the thing and saying this text is about social justice and so is science? I don't know. I'm not 100% comfortable with that. But I'm not 100% comfortable with people swearing an oath on a Bible either. I think you're going to put your hand on something, a Constitution's a pretty good choice, but the Constitution is not ideal either as a book, right? It's got some bad parts, but it is at least the founding document of the country, and there's some logic to it. And it brings up the kind of persistent dilemma that we've been talking about all the time. How do we use Jewish texts? How do other people do it? What do we think is right? How tied should we be to the original meaning? And what are the dangers of not paying attention to that set of meanings, right? Hillel's, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? The if not now, when is really difficult to square up to the rest of it, reading it the way we do as moderns. It's easier to square up if you take the traditional meaning and layer it on. So what are the dangers of not paying attention to the set of meanings that were originally at work behind this text? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. This is sort of the persistent thing that is always part of how anybody interacts with a 2,000-year-old text, but is particularly difficult, I think, for humanistic Jews, because how tied are we to the original meaning? There's a tendency to look at these texts and go, they meant something, and they meant something to the people who put them together, and honoring that meaning maybe means that we don't use them the same way as other Jews might use it. So that's sort of the challenge that's presented, and makes many of us think differently about whether science advisors should be putting their hands on these books. Whereas a lot of Jews were very, very, very excited, right? The Forward had an article on it, and all these local Jewish newspapers had articles on this, and the Washington Post had it. And, you know, there was a lot of interest in the unusual choice of a still religious document. So that it still leaves us at the same place, trying to figure out the same things. So I'm happy to take questions. I'm gonna leave my computer in the setup that it's in, so I won't be able to see you, but that way I also don't record your face, because I know not everybody wants their face on camera. They'll have your voice, but it won't have your face. It doesn't have the list of participants. So Roberto, go ahead.
Right. So, and I know we spoke about that. I mean, as you said, that's the theme that continues, right? As a Jewish humanist, how we, you know, we is that, you know, how are we creating this link with this document that is, you know, primarily religious, right? And are we entitled to make the interpretation that we want? But again, so for a couple of things, one is, in terms of the man of science, right, the person of science, I mean, my question, I think, is more on the sense of why not? I mean, my question is more on, I mean, I don't see him making a statement that the Torah is guiding his science, right? So all he's doing is deriving the ethical interpretation that he wants from that, right? Not giving that, even if he can even be, and I don't know if he's a believer or not, right? Or he's purely focused on the ethics. But even if he is, right, at no point he's implying that he's mixing up his commitment to science with that, other than making that free interpretation that you mentioned about science as a tikkun olam, which is again, I don't know what to make of that, but I don't really see any problem, right? As long as he's able, and I believe he is, to make the separation between what is science and what is his link to those texts, right, being ethical or anything else. And in terms of interpretation, I know this is a longer discussion, but just again, weren't the same writers of the Mishnah making interpretation of the Torah? Wasn't the people of the Talmud? Isn't that not a sequence of people taking upon themselves the position or the authority to interpret that? So again, as Jewish humanists, are we having less of that right, that someone else that declared that they were entitled to make the right interpretation of the Torah? So the whole Talmud is based on something that was created in a different phase, right, and not linked to the original Torah. So what is that a vantage point that they have that we, many centuries later wouldn't have? So that that's what I want to say.
Yeah, there's no answers. I'm not going to pretend I have answers. I don't have great answers. It's complicated. Dunya, go ahead.
I guess there are a couple of things. I hope I remember everything that was kind of going through my mind. I think this has been really very interesting, and every time you do something like this, it's incredibly interesting. But I think of it on more of an academic level, and then I think some of the questions you're asking are probably more on a practical level, and in part that way where even this slide that you have up about being tied to original meaning, the first thing I thought of was, how much of the Supreme Court is going to interpret the Constitution by its original meaning. And I think we have to be careful when we try to do that, because as you point out, we don't necessarily even know what the originals were. So, I mean, that was part of it. But I also think that I think it's very symbolic what he did. And that was part of the reaction from what you mentioned, the different presses that responded. And I think it's a way of saying to the world that, Jews have ethics too. We don't need to, just be quoting the Bible and accessing God all the time, but that, we have things that really make us good people, and we do science as well, and they can go together. So I think in a way, it's nice to know more about what it actually is. And I think his statements reflected that he probably knows a little something. He didn't just pick it up from his bookshelf.
Right.
So I don't have a problem with it. I guess that's
no.
Probably because I don't know as much as you do. So
I don't know. I mean, they're everybody's going to have a kind of different level of okayness with this. So I'm not saying I have answers. I just kind of know where I ended up landing.
Oh, it's a good question. It doesn't offend me, though, especially after you've gone through all of the analysis of it and then came back to his statement. It doesn't bother me. So that's where I stand.
Okay. Michael.
Yeah. I have to say, I agree with basically everything you said, but my view would be, of all the let's just say, kind of ethics that what we call ethics is really post-Enlightenment ethics. Prior to the Enlightenment, people just didn't have concern for outsiders. The other was subhuman, pretty much universally. until 200-300 years ago. And so if you're going to have documents from prior to that time, the Pirkei Avot is probably the best in our tradition. You wouldn't want to put your hands on the Torah, which is horrifying. You wouldn't want to put your hands on the whole Mishnah if you could, although you'd have to pile it up for many feet. You couldn't put your hands on it, but in principle, you wouldn't want to. It's xenophobic, it's horrifying in so many ways. This can at least be interpreted on the surface as saying things that are, maybe they're more Torah oriented than we like to think of them, but they're not outrageously, anybody who's not like us is basically not worthy of consideration, which is what all those other documents say. So I would just put it that way. It's probably the best of the, and this, but you're right, this is a total problem in our movement. You know, the movement was founded on the idea, humanistic Judaism was founded on the idea that we're post-Enlightenment people and that we should be studying post-Enlightenment texts. And the reality is that that really doesn't work. That we just have too much interest in traditional texts, and that's why we spend all this time with you studying them. If you were reading us early Zionist thinkers, you wouldn't get one of us after the second. And you know, and those were the people who talked about what, and I mean by Zionists, I don't mean that in a political sense, but people in the 1880s trying to figure out what are we going to make with the Jews? What are the Jews going to do? There just wouldn't be any interest. People are interested in these old texts, and this is the least offensive of them as far as I'm concerned. I've actually gone through it sometime in the past, and I really didn't find, there's one little comment in there about don't spend too much time talking to women. But that's just a little comment, and it really is saying you should be focused on the Torah. That's why you shouldn't be spending too much time talking to women, because women don't study the Torah. It's bad. That's probably the most offensive thing in the Pirkei Avot. You can't say that about any other traditional Jewish text, that they're that unoffensive.
Yeah. And honestly, I wouldn't come back for a second go around reading Zionist texts either. That would not be my thing.
Right.
Dunya, you've got a virtual hand up.
Sorry, no, I should take it down. It was from before.
Okay. Let's see. I think I can do that. There we go. So happy to answer questions if there are more questions. But this is my last slide. So if you're looking at the clock and going, it's 9:30, I'm tired, and or it's 9:30, I got to get ready to watch. Jon Stewart's not on anymore, but Trevor Noah or whoever. You won't miss any more presentation if you say I'm going to bed now, or watching Trevor Noah, or